You have no idea what happened when I saw that picture of her.
I only said one sentence, one single stupid sentence, on the phone, sitting at my desk, just a few feet from his office. Theo, he's so hot it should be illegal. And then the air changed. I didn't even hear the footsteps. I just felt it. That shift you notice on your skin before your brain catches up, like someone had sucked all the oxygen out of the hallway. I turned slowly, and there he was, Lucien Beaumont, my boss. Gray eyes locked on me with an expression that wasn't anger. It was something else. He called me into his office. Every word measured, every silence calculated. I should have been scared. But what I took away from that room was the unsettling certainty that, when his eyes lingered on mine for half a second longer than they needed to, he was holding himself back. I didn't know who Lucien Beaumont really was. All I knew was that every time I got too close, the air between us grew heavy with things he refused to say. What I didn't know was that someone was already moving the pieces, and that the two of us, him and me, were part of a game that had started long before that sentence on the phone. Hi, I'm Lena, and this story is just beginning. Chapter 1: The Wrong Hallway. I had 3 rules for surviving at Beaumont Corp. Don't be late, don't mess up the reports, and above all, don't look at Lucien Beaumont for more than 2 seconds. I followed the first 2 with discipline. The third was a joke I told myself every morning as I swiped my badge at the turnstile and pretended the man who owned the place didn't get to me in a way I couldn't explain. The office sat on the top floor of a glass and stone building in the heart of Marseille, the kind of place where people spoke quietly, not out of politeness, but because they seemed afraid of being overheard. I'd been working there for almost 2 years as an administrative assistant, and I still hadn't figured out why everyone seemed to know something I didn't. There was a permanent tension in the hallways, a weight that didn't match spreadsheets and meeting minutes. But I'd learned early on that asking too many questions in that environment was the fastest way to end up unemployed. On that Tuesday in October, the workday dragged on like always. I was at my desk reviewing an operational cost spreadsheet when my phone buzzed. Theo. My best friend. Freelance designer, the only person in the world who knew every stupid thought that crossed my mind, and who, by some miracle of nature, still hadn't given up on me. I opened the message under my desk, phone propped on my lap like a teenager in the back of a classroom. Boredom scale, 1 to 10? I typed fast. 11. I'm reviewing a spreadsheet with more rows than my will to live. Drama? Tell me something good to balance it out. I should have typed it. I should have written my answer with my fingers, in silence, like any sensible person would in an office where even the air seemed to be monitored. But Theo had that effect on me. He made me forget where I was. And at that specific moment, I was in my office, the room just before my boss's, with my phone to my ear because he'd called, and I, as always, picked up without thinking. Theo, I'm at work, I said quietly, walking toward the break room. And I'm in the middle of a briefing that's sucking my soul out, so that makes 2 of us. Tell me something that makes me want to keep living. I laughed, and that was the exact moment my 3rd rule died a spectacular death. My boss, I said, my voice a little lower, checking the hallway ahead. Theo, he's so hot it should be illegal. Like, there should genuinely be a law against men like that walking around in a suit at 8 in the morning. Theo let out a laugh so loud I could hear it even with the phone 2 centimeters from my ear. I laughed too, that nervous, loose laugh of someone who thinks she's safe, who's sure the hallway is empty and that no one in the world would hear something like that. Until I felt it. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't a footstep. It was a shift in the temperature of the air, as if someone had drained all the oxygen from the hallway at once. My entire body reacted before my mind did, and I knew, the way you know you're going to fall before you trip, that someone was behind me. I turned slowly, and there he was, Lucien Beaumont, standing less than 6 feet away, in a dark suit that looked like it had been sewn onto his body. Gray eyes locked on me with an expression I couldn't decipher. He didn't look irritated. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a man deciding what to do with a piece of information he'd just received. Theo, I'll call you back, I murmured, and hung up without waiting for a response. The silence between us lasted 3 seconds. 3 seconds that felt like an entire semester. Lucien didn't move, neither did I. Part of me wanted the floor to open up and swallow me whole, but the other part, the part that clearly had no survival instinct, stood there, holding his gaze as if that were a reasonable option. My office, he said. That was it. His voice was low, controlled, with no inflection whatsoever, and yet every syllable landed like a sentence. I followed him. What else was I going to do? His office was at the end of the hallway, behind a set of dark wooden double doors I'd opened dozens of times to drop off documents, coffee, reports. But that day, crossing through those doors felt different. The air inside was colder, or maybe I was too warm, and the space between us seemed to shrink with every step I took toward the chair he indicated, with a minimal gesture of his hand. Lucian didn't sit. He stood, leaning against the edge of his own desk, arms crossed over his chest, and looked down at me with the calm of a man who had never needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. Comments about the appearance of hierarchical superiors are inappropriate in the workplace, Eloise, he said, and my name in his mouth sounded like a warning. Regardless of whether they're made in the hallway or during personal calls the entire company can hear. I swallowed hard. The urge to defend myself fought with the awareness that anything I said at that moment would only make things worse. So I did something I rarely do. I stayed quiet. I expect it won't happen again, he added, uncrossing his arms in a gesture that signaled the conversation was over. I stood up, murmured "it won't happen again" that barely held itself together in the air, and walked out of his office with the dignity of someone who'd just been hit by a train and was pretending she could still walk in a straight line. I crossed the hallway without looking sideways, grabbed my bag from my desk, and left 20 minutes before the end of the workday, because if I stayed one more second in that building, I was either going to cry or quit, and neither option paid my rent. On the way home, I passed through the lobby of my building and found Renaud, the doorman, in his usual spot. He was a man in his early 40s, attentive and polite, the kind of doorman who knew every resident's name and asked about everyone's day with a sincerity that felt too rare for Marseille. "Rough day, Mademoiselle Renard?" he asked, holding the door for me. "Is it showing on my face?" "A little," he replied with a discreet smile, "but tomorrow's a new day." I thanked him and went upstairs. I dropped my bag on the couch, changed clothes, and headed to the neighborhood gym. Because when my head isn't working, I need to wear my body out until it shuts my mind up. Sylvain, my personal trainer, was already waiting for me. He was young, strong, always with an easy smile and an energy that usually rubbed off on me. But that day I wasn't in the mood for conversation. "What's with the face?" he asked while adjusting the weights. "Bad day or bad week?" "Bad day that's planning to evolve into a bad week if I don't punch something in the next 30 minutes. He laughed and pointed to the punching bag. I trained until my arms went numb, and when I got home, I took a shower that lasted longer than it should have and collapsed on the couch with my phone in hand. I called Theo. "First things first," he said the moment he picked up. "I need to know, are you still employed?" "Technically, yes. And emotionally, destroyed." "Theo, he heard everything. Everything. He was behind me in the hallway and I didn't even notice. He called me into his office and gave me a lecture so cold and polite that I wished he'd just yelled, because at least yelling is human. That was surgical." Theo was quiet for a second, which meant the situation was serious, because he was never quiet. "And how are you now?" I'm swearing to myself that I'm never looking at Lucien Beaumont again. Never again. It's done. Dead. "Buried. Eloise," his voice came with that tone of someone who's seen this movie before. "The last time you swore something like that, 3 days later you were crying on my couch with a bottle of wine and a speech about how his eyes looked like gray with storm-edged rims." "I never said that." "You did. I have the screenshot." I laughed, despite everything, and we stayed on the phone for another hour talking about nothing and everything, the way only Theo and I knew how. When I hung up, the apartment was dark, and the silence of Marseille drifted in through the window, as if the entire city had decided to fall asleep at the same time. I closed my eyes and tried to empty my mind, but the image kept coming back. Lucien Beaumont standing in the hallway, with that look that wasn't anger, wasn't embarrassment, and wasn't indifference. It was something else, something I couldn't name, and that, for that very reason, wouldn't leave me alone. The lecture had been flawless. Every word measured, every pause calculated, every second timed to make me feel the exact weight of my recklessness. Any normal person would have walked out of that room thinking about the mistake and the fear of losing her job. But I wasn't just anyone, and what I took away from that room wasn't fear. It was the unsettling certainty that, in the instant before he dismissed me, when his eyes lingered on mine for half a second longer than necessary, Lucien Beaumont wasn't just reprimanding me, he was holding himself back. Chapter 2. One night, just one. The days that followed were an exercise in mutual invisibility. Lucien Beaumont existed in the office as a presence I felt before I saw, the sound of his footsteps in the hallway, the cologne that lingered in the air after he passed, the subtle shift in everyone's posture when he entered a room. I avoided him with the precision of someone who'd drawn a mental map of every possible route on the executive floor. And he, apparently, did the same with me. Apparently. Because on the third day, I noticed he was watching me. Not head-on, never head-on. Lucien was too calculated to give himself away like that, but I felt the weight of that gaze on my back when I walked into the conference room to drop off a folder, when I crossed the hallway with a stack of documents, when I stood by the printer waiting for a copy that was taking too long. Every time I turned around, he'd already looked away, eyes fixed on a report or his computer screen, with the composure of someone who would never be distracted by something as trivial as another person's presence. But the details betrayed him. On the fourth day, I walked into his office to leave the minutes from a meeting, and he was on the phone. Any other boss would have waved me off without looking up from the call. Lucien stopped mid-sentence, looked at me as if he needed to verify I was real, and only resumed the conversation once I'd set the document on the desk and taken a step back. On the fifth day, I was stepping out of the elevator and he was stepping in, and he changed direction, as if he'd suddenly remembered something urgent on the floor above. He hadn't. I could see in the reflection of the glass door that he stood still in the hallway for 3 seconds before walking again. And then there was Cillian. Cillian Durieux was Lucien's right-hand man, a broad-shouldered man with a closed-off expression who seemed to have been born in a suit with a comm piece in his ear. He spoke little, always walked 2 steps behind his boss, and had the kind of presence that didn't draw attention until you realized he was everywhere. On Wednesday, he showed up in the break room while I was pouring coffee. He didn't say a word. He leaned against the door frame, checked something on his phone, and left. On Thursday, I found him standing near my desk when I came back from lunch. He also said nothing. He also left. If it had been any other man, I would have found it odd. But Cillian had that silent way about him that made every move seem like protocol, as if surveilling the surroundings was simply part of the routine. I told Theo everything, because I always told Theo everything, and his analysis was surgical. "He's avoiding you," he said, with the authority of someone who watches telenovelas and reads about body language with the same level of dedication. "But he's doing a bad job of it. When a man truly avoids you, you don't even notice. When he avoids you like this, it's because he wants you to notice, or because I made a terrible impression and he wants professional distance. Eloise, sweetheart, professional is ignoring you. Changing course when he sees you in the hallway is panic." I wanted to argue, but I had nothing. Theo was right, and we both knew it. On Friday, the office emptied early. There was an off-site meeting that had taken most of the team, and by 6 in the evening, I was one of the few people left on the floor. I was at my desk organizing the last files of the day when I noticed the light in Lucien's office was still on. That wasn't unusual. He was almost always the last to leave. But that week, there was something different about his hours, as if he was staying late on purpose, waiting for the floor to clear out. I was closing the last folder when I heard his office door open, not footsteps, the door, as if he'd been standing there for a while before deciding to come out. I looked up and found Lucien standing 6 feet from me, jacket draped over his arm and tie slightly loosened, which in itself was a sight I wasn't prepared to process, because Lucien Beaumont with a loosened tie was the visual equivalent of a fire alarm. He had a glass in his hand, whiskey, judging by the amber tone, and it was half empty, which meant the office composure had needed chemical reinforcement that evening. "Eloise," he said, and the way he said my name made my stomach clench. It wasn't the tone from the lecture. It was the voice of a man who'd spent 5 days trying not to say what he was about to say, and who had finally lost the fight with himself. "Can I talk to you?" "Of course," I replied, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, which was a small personal victory. He glanced around, confirming we were alone, and took another step closer. The distance between us shrank to something that wasn't professional by any measure. I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, that cologne I'd already come to associate with danger and things I shouldn't want. "What I'm about to say isn't appropriate," he began, and the honesty of the sentence caught me off guard. "And you have every right to refuse." I didn't say anything. Not because I was calm, but because my heart was beating so loud I was afraid that if I opened my mouth, that's the only sound that would come out. Lucien looked me in the eyes with an intensity that made me want to step back and move forward at the same time, and said in a low, controlled voice, but with something behind it I'd never heard before, something that seemed to cost him dearly to let out. "One night, just one. No explanation, no continuation, no promises." The office hung suspended. I could hear the barely perceptible hum of the fluorescent lights above us, and the sound of my own breathing, which had gone shallow without me realizing it. Lucien didn't move. He stood there, watching me, waiting, with the dangerous patience of a man who had already calculated every possible answer and was prepared for each one. "Why?" I asked. "Because I needed something that made sense. Anything I could use to justify what my entire body had already decided." "If you need a reason," he replied, and the corner of his mouth shifted in a way that wasn't quite a smile but made my pulse spike. "The reason is me wanting to." I should have said no. Anyone with a shred of self-preservation would have said no. He was my boss. The proposition had no future, no logic, and not the slightest chance of ending well for either of us. I knew all of that. I knew it with the rational clarity of someone who lists the reasons in an organized column and ignores every single one. "Okay," I said, and the 2 shortest words I'd ever spoken sealed the biggest mistake and the best decision of my life at the same time. We went to his apartment. I expected something ostentatious, something that matched the suit and the posture, and that way of looking at you that made the air feel heavy, but the place was more restrained than I'd imagined. Spacious, dark, sparsely furnished, with a view of Marseille that turned the city into a constellation of yellow lights reflected in the harbor. Lucien locked the door behind us and stood in the entryway for a second, as if deciding something. When he turned to me, his eyes were different, less controlled, less calculated, as if he'd left the armor at the threshold. He approached slowly. He raised his hand and touched my face with a gentleness I didn't expect from a man with those hands. And his hands were large, firm, with fingers that felt warm against my skin. His thumb traced the line of my jaw, slid down to my chin, and stayed there, holding my face as if he wanted to make sure I wasn't going anywhere. "If at any point you want to stop," he said, his voice rough and far too close, "say the word, and I stop. And if I don't want to stop." The smile he gave was the most dangerous thing I'd ever seen, and then he kissed me. The kiss started slow, his mouth against mine with controlled pressure, as if he were testing himself, measuring how much he could give in before losing control. But when my hand slid up the back of his neck, and my fingers closed around the short hair at the base, something shifted. The restraint broke in an instant, and he pulled me close with both hands on my waist, his fingers firm enough for me to feel the pressure through the fabric of my blouse. He guided me backward until the backs of my knees touched the edge of the bed. Without breaking the kiss, Lucien slid his hands along my waist, rising slowly up the sides of my body, feeling every curve as if he wanted to memorize it. His fingers found the buttons of my blouse and undid them one by one, with an almost cruel patience. The fabric slipped off my shoulders, baring warm skin to the night air. He broke the kiss only to look, not with haste, but with a quiet intensity that made my pulse race. His lips traveled down my neck, tracing a slow, deliberate path to the curve of my collarbone. Each kiss was a silent promise, a touch that burned without rushing. His hands followed, sliding down my back, unclasping my bra with practiced ease. The fabric fell away, and the cool air contrasted with the heat of his palms as they cupped my breasts. Lucien caressed them with reverence, his thumbs grazing the hardened peaks in slow circles, drawing from me a trembling sigh that he captured with his mouth once more. I pulled him closer, wanting more. My hands explored his chest, undoing the buttons of his shirt with fingers less patient than his. When I finally felt the warm, firm skin beneath my palms, a low breath escaped his throat. He laid me down on the bed carefully, his body covering mine without crushing it. His mouth descended further, tracing wet kisses along the valley between my breasts, down my stomach to the edge of my skirt. With a look that asked permission and at the same time wouldn't take no for an answer, he slid the fabric down my legs, along with the last piece of lace that remained. Now there were no more barriers. Lucien positioned himself between my thighs, his firm hands gripping my hips as his mouth explored the sensitive skin of my inner legs. When his tongue finally touched the most delicate spot, my fingers tangled in his hair, my body trembling on the edge of the abyss, and I came apart, breathless and shaking. He made his way back up my body, kissing every inch of skin along the way. When our eyes met again, there was something raw and vulnerable in his gaze. Lucien settled between my legs, his body taut with restrained desire. I felt the heat of him drawing near, pressing gently against me. Slowly, he joined with me, inch by inch, filling me completely. A deep sigh escaped both of us at the same time. He paused for a moment, letting me adjust, his forehead resting against mine. Then he began to move, slowly and deeply at first, then with a more urgent, more intense rhythm. My body molded to his, as if it had been made for this. His hands gripped my hips, guiding the movement, while my nails traced light lines across his broad back. Every thrust sent waves of pleasure through me. Every shared breath pulled us closer to the edge. His voice faltered when he murmured my name against my ear, rough and broken. I felt his body tense, muscles rigid beneath my hands. The pleasure built between us again, stronger this time. When the climax reached me, it was like a tide that swept me under, wrapping us in intense, exquisite waves. Lucien followed soon after, his body shuddering against mine, a low, muffled sound escaping as he surrendered completely, his arms tightening around me as if he never wanted to let go. The night that followed was everything he'd promised, and everything he hadn't said. He was different when we were alone. The control remained, but it had cracks. Moments when his breathing faltered against my ear, when his fingers gripped my skin too hard before easing up, when he said my name as if the word hurt on the way out. The Lucien from the office was a fortress. The Lucien in that bed was a man trying not to lose himself, and losing anyway. Afterward, he drove me home. The car crossed the streets of Marseille in silence, and neither of us tried to fill the space with words that wouldn't serve any purpose. When he stopped in front of my building, I waited. I waited for him to say something, anything, that would contradict what he'd laid out in the office, to make an exception, to change the rule. Lucien stared straight ahead, hands on the wheel, jaw tight, and said in a voice lower than every other time, "This can't happen again." I opened the car door, got out, and walked into the building without looking back. Renaud was at the front desk, as always, but I moved past too quickly for him to ask anything. I took the stairs because the elevator would take too long, and I needed movement. I needed my body to do something other than remember his. Inside the apartment, I locked the door, pressed my back against it, and slid to the floor. I stayed there for a full minute, my breathing still unsteady and his scent soaked into my skin. I picked up my phone and called Theo. "Theo," I said before he could get a word out. "I'm screwed." He was silent for a second. Then, "You slept with him." "Worse," I replied, closing my eyes. I liked it. On what level of screwed are we talking? Screwed like I ate a cookie on my diet? Or screwed like I need a lawyer? Like, I'm going to need to move to another country. So it's bad, Theo sighed. "Tell me everything, from the beginning, with details," I told him. And as I did, as I turned what had happened in that apartment into words, I felt the distance growing between what I wanted and what he had offered. One night, just one. The rules had been set, and I had accepted every single one of them. The next morning, I arrived at the office wearing the strongest armor I could put together. Flawless makeup, straight posture, professional expression. Lucian was already in his office when I passed the glass corridor, and he didn't look up. He didn't nod. He didn't acknowledge my presence in any visible way. It was as if the night before had been a dream only I'd had. I walked down the hallway toward my desk with my chin up and my chest tight, telling myself over and over that this was expected. He'd warned me. I'd agreed. There was no room for disappointment inside a deal I'd signed myself. But when I passed his office door, in the narrowest stretch of the hallway where no one but the two of us could fit, Lucian's hand brushed against mine. The touch lasted less than a second, his fingers against mine, light, quick, almost imperceptible. Anyone watching would have thought it was an accident, that two bodies had crossed the same space and touched by chance. But it wasn't chance. I felt the intention in that touch, the same intention I'd felt the night before, when he held my face and looked at me as if I were the last thing he should want, and the only thing he couldn't avoid. I kept walking. I didn't look back. But when I reached my desk and sat down, I saw out of the corner of my eye that Cillian was standing at the end of the hallway, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. He'd seen it. I knew he'd seen it, and he knew I knew, because he looked away with the shadow of a smile, so brief it could have been my imagination, before turning and following Lucian back into the office. I opened my computer, put my hands on the keyboard, and pretended my heart wasn't pounding as if I'd just run a marathon, because the truth I couldn't tell anyone, not Theo, not even myself, was that one night hadn't been enough, and judging by the touch in the hallway, I had the terrible suspicion that it hadn't been enough for him either. Chapter 3. The Weight She Doesn't See. I tried to move on. I swear I tried. I spent the entire weekend building a mental strategy that included not thinking about the touch in the hallway, not thinking about his scent on my skin, and not thinking about the way he said my name that night, with his voice breaking against my ear. The strategy lasted until Monday at 8:12 a.m., when I stepped off the elevator and his cologne hung in the air as if the hallway walls had memorized Lucian Beaumont's presence. At the office, something had changed. Not in me, in everything around me. Lucian was more tense, more absent, with an energy I could only describe as compressed, as if he'd been holding something too heavy for too long. His meetings lasted twice as long as usual. The office doors stayed shut for hours on end, and on Tuesday morning I heard shouting. Not the kind you hear in an ordinary argument. They were deep voices, muffled by the thick glass walls, but loaded with an urgency that made the secretary on the floor below look up and exchange a glance with me that said, "Don't ask." I didn't ask, but I watched. Cillian was going in and out of Lucian's office at a frequency that wasn't normal, always with an expression more closed off than usual, which, for a man who already seemed to have been born with his face locked tight, was saying a lot. Calls were answered in low voices and ended whenever someone came near. Documents were tucked into drawers I'd never seen locked before. The air on the executive floor was thick with something I couldn't name, but that made the back of my neck prickle every time I passed his office door. That day, I got home earlier and went straight to my room to change. As I opened the closet, my eyes fell on the picture frame that sat on the shelf beside it, an old photo, its edges slightly yellowed with time, of me as a child, sitting on the lap of a woman with dark hair and a wide smile, Aunt Colette, my mother's younger sister, or rather, the sister of the woman who raised me, my father's wife. I picked up the photo and ran my thumb across the glass, studying her face. People always said I looked like her, more than anyone else in the family. The eyes, the shape of the chin, the way the smile pulled more to one side than the other. It was one of those comments I'd been hearing since I was little and never questioned, because children don't question the stories adults tell about them. Colette had passed away before I turned 6, and all I kept of her were fragments, the scent of lavender, a loud laugh, this photo. I placed the frame back and closed the closet. On Wednesday, something different happened at the office. I was in the break room making coffee when a man I'd never seen walked in as if the space belonged to him. He was tall, thin, in a light gray suit that seemed chosen to appear harmless, and a face that matched the suit, pleasant at first glance, with a wide smile that reached his eyes and stayed there, too comfortable, as though it had been rehearsed in front of a mirror hundreds of times until it hit the exact dosage of charm. Bastian Morel, he introduced himself, extending his hand. I've worked with Lucian for many years. I shook his hand and felt his cold, dry fingers against mine. Bastian was the kind of man who conveyed refinement and control in every gesture, but there was something underneath, a layer of calculation I couldn't ignore, as if every word that left his mouth had already been weighed 3 times before being spoken. Eloise Renard, I replied, administrative assistant. I know who you are, he said, and the smile didn't shrink. How long have you worked here? Almost 2 years. And who recommended you for the position? The question caught me in a strange way, not because of the content. It was a simple, normal question, the kind any coworker might ask, but because of the way he asked it, with his head slightly tilted and his eyes fixed on mine, as if the answer mattered more than the casual conversation suggested. I submitted my resume through the company website, I answered, with a smile that mirrored his in politeness but not in warmth. Standard hiring process. Interesting, he said, and brought the coffee cup to his lips without taking his eyes off me. Lucien tends to be selective about who works close to him. You must be competent. Before I could respond, the break room door opened and Lucien appeared. He stopped in the doorway as if he'd frozen for a fraction of a second. His eyes went from me to Bastian, and back to me at a speed an inattentive person wouldn't have caught. But I wasn't inattentive. I'd been hyper-aware of every move Lucien made since the night he touched me, as if I were the last real thing in the world, and so I saw the shift. His posture stiffened, his jaw locked, and when he spoke, his voice had that cutting quality I already recognized, polished on the surface, lethal underneath. Bastian, he said, just that, and the name sounded like a territorial reminder. They're waiting for you in the conference room. Bastian smiled, that same calibrated smile, and nodded before turning to me. It was a pleasure, Eloise. I'm sure we'll see each other again. He left without hurry, with the smooth steps of someone who knows no one is going to shut the door on him. When the break room was empty, Lucien remained in the doorway for 2 seconds longer than necessary, staring at the space where Bastian had been, before turning to me. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes said something I couldn't translate, and that he had no intention of explaining. He left without a word. I stood there with the cup in my hand, and the clear feeling that I'd just witnessed something that went far beyond a conversation about coffee. The rest of the week passed with the weight of an anchor. Lucien was increasingly distant, not just from me, but from everything. The meetings grew longer, the doors more closed, the hallways quieter, and I found myself caught between 2 things I didn't know how to reconcile: the urge to get closer to him, and the growing certainty that something big was happening around me, something I didn't understand, and that no one intended to explain. On Thursday afternoon, I was waiting for the elevator to go down when the doors opened and Lucien was inside, alone. Our eyes met, and I saw, for a fraction of a second, that same crack in his composure I'd seen the night he touched my face for the first time. I stepped into the elevator because the alternative was to wait for the next one and admit I was running, and Eloise Renard didn't run from anything, even when she should. The doors closed and the space shrank. The elevator was wide enough for 6 people, but with Lucien inside it felt half the size. I could feel the heat radiating from him, the cologne I already knew from too close, and the silence that settled between us like a third presence, dense, charged, impossible to ignore. He broke first, but not the way I expected. "Are you okay?" he asked, without looking at me, eyes fixed on the descending numbers on the panel. The question caught me off guard, not because of what it said, but because of what it let slip. A concern that didn't match the man who'd told me this can't happen again, and spent the following days pretending I was just another employee among many. "Do you care now?" I replied, and the sarcasm came out before I could stop it. Lucien turned his face and looked at me, and instead of moving closer, instead of closing the distance between us the way I expected, the way my entire body wanted him to, he did something worse. He spoke. "I shouldn't," he said, and his voice carried an honesty that disarmed me more than any touch. "Care about you. It's not part of what I'm allowed to have." The words hung in the elevator air like something solid. I opened my mouth to respond, but he continued, his eyes on mine now, without flinching, without the armor. "But I hear your footsteps in the hallway, and I know it's you before I turn around. I know what time you arrive, which door you come through, and which chair you sit in during meetings. And I hate knowing those things, Eloise, because every single one of them is proof that I've failed at treating you like just another person in that office." The elevator stopped. The mechanical sound of the doors cut through the sentence I hadn't managed to form, and Lucien recomposed himself with a speed that would have been impressive if I hadn't just seen what existed beneath. When the doors opened fully, his hands were already in his pockets, and he wore the neutral expression of a man who would never lose control in his own company's elevator. I stepped out first, I didn't look back, not because I didn't want to, but because I knew that if I did, he would see in my eyes the same thing I'd seen in his, and neither of us was ready to admit what that meant. That night, already home, with the apartment dark and the distant sound of Marseille's traffic drifting through the window, my phone rang. The name on the screen made my stomach drop before I even answered. Gérard Renard, my father. The relationship between us was functional. On the best of days. Gérard was a practical man, of few words and even less affection, the kind of father who did the bare minimum after my mother, the woman who raised me, passed away, but who never figured out how to fill the space she left behind. Our calls were short, spaced out, almost always about practical things. He didn't call to ask how I was doing, and when he called outside the pattern, it was because something had gone sideways. "Eloise," he said, and his voice was different from usual, deeper, heavier, as if every word carried a weight he didn't want to release. "I need to talk to you, in person." "About what?" "It's not a phone conversation. Can we do it tomorrow?" The way he said tomorrow didn't sound like a request. It sounded like a deadline, and the way he hung up without saying goodbye, quick, dry, with no room for more questions, left me holding my phone with a knot in my stomach I couldn't untie. I sat on the couch for a long time, staring at the dark phone screen. Something was wrong. I felt it with the same irrational certainty I'd felt Lucien behind me in that hallway weeks before, not through logic, but through instinct. The kind of instinct that kicks in when your body senses danger before your mind does. And my mind, that night, was too preoccupied with the almost touch in the elevator to realize that the danger wasn't coming from where I expected. Chapter 4: The Bargaining Chip. I met Gérard the next day, at a cafe near the Vieux Port that he'd chosen by text without explaining why. It was a small place, with dark wooden tables and dim lighting, the kind of establishment that seemed to exist for conversations no one wanted to have out loud. When I arrived, he was already sitting in the back, with an untouched cup in front of him, and his hands clasped on the table in a posture I didn't recognize, because Gérard Renard was many things, but nervous had never been one of them. I sat in the chair across from him and waited. He didn't greet me. He didn't ask how I was. He just looked at me for a few seconds with that closed-off face I'd known since childhood, the face of a man who always seemed to carry the world on his shoulders and never found it necessary to explain the weight to anyone. "I'm going to be direct," he said, and his voice came out low, controlled, but with a note I'd never heard before. Fear. Gérard Renard was afraid. I got involved with people I shouldn't have. I made bad deals. I took on debts I can't pay. I opened my mouth to ask what he was talking about, but he raised his hand. A minimal, authoritative gesture that silenced me before I could form the first word. "The only way out," he continued, and his eyes locked on mine with an intensity that made me go cold, "is a marriage. You're getting married next week to the head of an organization. It's a deal. It's sealed." The cafe around us kept running. The waiters kept serving. The clink of cups against saucers kept its steady, normal rhythm, but inside me, everything stopped. His words entered one at a time, as if my brain needed to process each one individually before assembling them into a sentence that made sense. And when it did, the sentence was so absurd that my first reaction wasn't fear, wasn't anger. It was laughter. "You're joking," I said. He didn't blink. "Do I look like I'm joking, Eloise?" He didn't. And that's when the ground disappeared. "Marriage?" My voice rose without my permission. "You're telling me I have to marry a stranger because you got yourself into debt? Dad, this isn't the 18th century. You can't just hand me over to someone like I'm some kind of—" "If you run," he cut in, and the sentence came down with the weight of a blade. "We both die." The silence that fell over the table was unlike any silence I'd ever experienced. It wasn't empty. It was full, loaded, suffocating, as if the air between us had turned solid. I looked at my father's face and searched for any sign of a bluff, any crack in that expression that would tell me he was exaggerating, that there was a way out, that this was just a scare that could be resolved with a conversation or a loan, or anything that didn't involve me wearing white and saying yes to a man I'd never laid eyes on. I found nothing. Gérard was telling the truth, and the truth was the most brutal thing he'd ever given me. "Who?" I asked, and the word came out small, almost voiceless. "Who is he?" "I can't say the name right now. You'll find out on the day." "On the day?" I repeated, incredulous. "I'm going to find out who I'm marrying on the day of the wedding? That's how it works," he replied, and for the first time, his voice faltered on the last syllable, as if the sentence had a taste he couldn't swallow. "I didn't make the rules, Eloise. I just couldn't escape them." I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip the table, hurl the cup at the wall, walk out of that cafe and never look at the face of the man who raised me with the bare minimum of affection and was now asking for the maximum possible sacrifice. But nothing came out. The rage was stuck somewhere between my chest and my throat, too big to come out in words, and all I could do was sit there, eyes burning and hands shaking under the table. "1 week," he said, as if confirming a doctor's appointment. The wedding is in 5 days. 5 days, I repeated, and my voice finally broke. 5 days, Dad. You're giving me 5 days to accept that my life is over. Your life isn't going to end, he said, and something in his tone shifted. Something that in another person I would have called remorse, but in Gerard sounded more like calculation. It's going to change. That's different. I stood up. Not because I'd decided to leave, but because my body needed to move, or I was going to crumble right there, in that dark wooden chair, in the back of a cafe I would now hate for the rest of my life. I grabbed my bag with hands that were still shaking, and looked at my father one last time. I will never forgive you for this, I said, and I left. The walk to Theo's apartment was a blur. I didn't remember walking, taking the metro, climbing the stairs of his building. The only thing I remembered was ringing the doorbell. And when he opened the door with a smiling expression that died the second he saw my face, I collapsed. Theo caught me before I hit the floor, pulled me inside, and led me to the couch without asking a single question. Because Theo knew that when I was in that state, the words came on their own time, and pushing only made it worse. I cried long enough to soak his t-shirt. When I finally managed to speak, I told him everything. The debts, the marriage, the 5 days, the name I didn't know, and Theo listened to every word with the face of someone absorbing a blow in slow motion. And when I finished, he didn't say, "It's going to be okay," because that would be a lie, and Theo never lied to me. "What kind of people?" he asked quietly. "What kind of debt makes a man hand over his daughter?" "I don't know." He didn't say. He just said that if I refuse, we both die. Theo closed his eyes for a second and rubbed his face with the exhausted gesture of someone who's just been thrown into a situation with no good solution. "I can do some digging," he said, opening his eyes. "I can try to find out who he is before the day. If we know who the groom is, at least." "At least what, Theo?" I cut in, and it wasn't anger at him. It was anger at everything. "At least I know the face of the man who's buying me." He didn't answer. He pulled me close and sat there, in silence, with his arm around my shoulders while I cried again, this time more quietly, more deeply, the kind of crying that doesn't bring relief because the pain isn't passing, it's settling in. That night, I went home and didn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling with my mind spinning in circles that always arrived at the same place. In 5 days, I would be married to a stranger, a man who belonged to a world I didn't know, who moved debts and lives like pieces on a board, who had bought my father and was now receiving the daughter as change. Every scenario I imagined was worse than the last. An old man, violent, repulsive, with cold hands and dead eyes that would look at me as if I were an acquisition, an asset that needed to fulfill its function. And in the middle of that waking nightmare, like a separate form of torture, my mind went to Lucien, to the night, to the way his hands had held my face, to the almost touch in the elevator, to his voice saying one night, just one, and to the certainty I carried in my chest that, if the world were different, if the circumstances were something else, that night wouldn't have been the last, but the world wasn't different. And in 5 days, the body he had touched would belong to another man. On Monday, I arrived at the office and tried to hold my composure the way you build a dam with your bare hands, with effort, without conviction, and with the certainty that the water was going to leak. I sat at my desk, opened the day's reports, and pretended the words on the screen made sense. But the letters blurred together, and the numbers looked like they were written in a language I'd forgotten how to read. Lucien noticed. Not right away. During the morning, our paths didn't cross, and I was grateful for that. But in the afternoon, when I walked into his office to drop off the documents he'd requested, he looked at me in a way that made me stop. It wasn't the look of a boss checking on an employee. It was the look of the man who'd held me that night, who'd seen parts of me I didn't show anyone, and who now realized that something in those parts was broken. "Eloise," he said, and the tone was careful, almost surgical, as if he were afraid of pressing too hard. "What's going on?" I set the documents on the desk and pressed my fingers against the folder so he wouldn't see that my hands were trembling. "Nothing that has to do with work." I didn't ask about work. The sentence disarmed me, because that was exactly it. He wasn't asking as a boss. He was asking as the man who'd brushed his hand against mine in the hallway, who'd almost touched me in the elevator, who carried in his eyes the same thing I carried in my chest, and that neither of us had the courage to name. I almost told him. The truth was right there, on the tip of my tongue, ready to spill. The marriage, the debts, the fear, the stranger at the altar, but I couldn't, because I didn't know who the groom was, and telling Lucien I was going to marry another man would mean admitting the night had meant more than just a night, and I wasn't ready for that, not when he was the one who'd set the rule that it couldn't happen again. "I'm fine," I lied, and we both walked away knowing it was a lie. He looked at me for one more second, with that expression I was learning to read, the one that said he wanted to push, wanted to pull the truth out of me with the same efficiency he brought to everything in his life, but something stopped him. Maybe the same thing that stopped me from telling. "If you need anything," he said quietly, eyes on mine, "tell me." The irony hit me like a punch to the stomach. The man I needed, the only one in the world I would choose if the choice were mine, was exactly the one I couldn't have. I left the room without answering, because any word I said would betray everything I was trying to hide. Lucian was different too, and I could see it even through the fog of my own despair. Darker, quieter, with a tension in his shoulders that had nothing to do with meetings or reports. He carried a weight I couldn't identify, something that made him stand longer at his office window, looking out at Marseille as if the city held answers he couldn't find within those walls. Cillian stayed close, closer than usual, and the two of them exchanged glances that seemed like entire conversations, compressed into fractions of a second. I went home that day, with the feeling that the ground was slowly opening beneath my feet, and I had nothing to hold on to. I sat on the couch, took off my shoes, and stayed there, in silence, staring at my phone, hoping it would ring, and hoping it wouldn't at the same time. It rang. "Gerard, the date has been confirmed," he said, without preamble, as if reading from a list. "Friday, 4 days from now. The address arrives Thursday night. 4 days. At the cafe he'd said a week. Now it was 4 days. The countdown was shrinking, and with it the little time I'd still imagined having to find a way out. I hung up without answering. I held the phone and stared at my reflection in the dark screen. The face of a 25-year-old woman who in 4 days would belong to a man she didn't know, in a world she didn't understand, because of debts that weren't hers. And the only thing I could think about, the only thing that kept coming back, like a song you can't get out of your head, like a mark that won't fade, was Lucian's voice that night, in the dark apartment with the view of Marseille behind us, saying with his mouth far too close to mine, "One night, just one." I closed my eyes, and for the first time since it all began, I wished that night had been more. Chapter 5. The Man at the Altar. The 5 days passed the way countdowns pass for things you don't want to arrive, too fast when I wanted time to stop, and too slow when I was alone at night, lying in the dark, imagining the face of the man who would be waiting for me at the altar. I created versions of him in my head, dozens. A 60-year-old man with cold eyes and heavy hands, a 40-year-old with a predator's smile and the calculated patience of someone who buys people the way you buy property, a man who would look at me at the altar and see exactly what I was to him, a transaction, a receipt, proof that Gerard Renard's debt had been paid in flesh and bone. Each version was worse than the last, and none of them had a face, which made everything more terrifying, because fear without shape is the kind of fear that fills every space. On Friday morning, the dress arrived in a white box that Gerard had delivered to my apartment without warning. I lifted the lid and stared at the fabric as if it were a sentence wrapped in silk. It was beautiful, simple, fitted, with lace at the wrists, and a modest neckline that someone with good taste had chosen. And that was what disturbed me most. Someone had taken the trouble to pick a dress that suited me, which meant someone knew me well enough to get my style right, and I had no idea who that person was. Theo arrived an hour later. He walked into the apartment with red eyes he was trying to hide, a bag of croissants neither of us would eat, and a fragile determination to keep his composure that I knew wouldn't last. "If at any point you want to run," he said, dropping the bag on the table and looking at me with the seriousness he reserved for moments when the real world demanded more than humor. "I've got the car parked around the corner, a full tank, and zero respect for the law." I laughed. It was a small, wet laugh that died before it got anywhere, but it came out. And Theo smiled back as if that half laugh was enough to keep him standing. He helped me get dressed. He fastened the buttons on the back of the dress, while I held my hair up and tried not to look in the mirror, because the woman reflected there, in white, made up, with flowers pinned in her hair that Theo had arranged with trembling hands, looked like someone I didn't know, a woman being prepared for a delivery. "You look beautiful," Theo said, standing behind me, his hands on my shoulders. His voice cracked on the last syllable. "And I hate that you look beautiful for this." "Theo," I asked quietly, "don't cry, because if you cry, I cry, and if I cry now, I won't be able to walk out of this apartment." He took a deep breath, squeezed my shoulders once, and nodded. We went downstairs in silence. The car Gerard had sent was waiting in front of the building, black, discreet, with a driver who opened the door without saying a word. Renaud was at the front desk, and when he saw me in white, something in his face changed. He didn't say anything. He just nodded, more slowly than usual, as if he were wishing me luck in a way that didn't fit into words. Theo couldn't come with me. The driver informed us that only the bride and father were expected at the ceremony. I hugged Theo on the sidewalk with the strength of someone clinging to the last safe thing in the world, and he held me back just as hard, his face buried in my hair. "Text me the second you can," he whispered. The second. I nodded and got in the car. The door closed, and Marseille began passing by the window like a movie I was watching from the outside. The streets, the harbor, the trees, all the same, all indifferent, as if the city didn't know I was being taken to the moment that would split my life into before and after. Gerard was waiting at the entrance of an old chapel on a hilltop on the outskirts of the city. It was a building of pale stone, small, surrounded by cypress trees, with a solid wooden door that stood open like a mouth. He was in a dark suit, more put together than I'd ever seen him, and when he looked at me, something crossed his face. Something that could have been regret if I still believed he was capable of it. "You look beautiful," he said. "Don't talk to me," I replied, and walked past him toward the door. Inside the chapel, the pews were nearly empty. A handful of guests, faces I didn't recognize, men in suits with closed-off expressions, elegant women who looked at me with a curiosity that made me feel like an animal on display. Light came through the narrow windows in golden beams that cut through the air like blades, and at the far end near the altar, a figure was waiting, with his back to me. He had his back to me, in a dark suit, with broad shoulders, and the upright posture of someone who doesn't need to turn around to be noticed. His hands were clasped behind his body, and I could see his fingers move once, a minimal, almost imperceptible gesture that in any other man I wouldn't have caught. Gerard offered his arm. I took it because I needed something to keep me upright, and because the nave of the chapel seemed to have stretched to twice its size. Every step I took toward the altar was a step toward the unknown, and my mind, a traitor to the end, wouldn't let me forget that the only man I wanted to find at that altar was the only one I was certain wouldn't be there. Lucian. The name appeared in my head the way it had appeared every night since that Friday in his apartment, uninvited, unannounced, taking up every available space. The night, the hands, the voice, the almost touch in the elevator, the hand brushing mine in the hallway, everything he gave and everything he took away, everything that stayed and everything I would never have again. I reached the altar. The distance between me and that back was less than 6 feet. Gerard let go of my arm and stepped away, and I stood there, alone, with the bouquet trembling in my hands and my heart pounding so hard I was sure the guests could hear it. The man turned around, and the world stopped. I closed my eyes, opened them, closed them again, because the face in front of me couldn't be real, couldn't be there, didn't make sense in any version of reality I knew. Lucian Beaumont, my boss, the man from the one night, the man who had said, "This can't happen again," and was now standing at the altar of a chapel on the outskirts of Marseille, in a dark suit with the ring gleaming in the priest's hand beside him, looking at me with eyes that, for a fraction of a second, a fraction I would keep forever, were as wide as mine. He didn't know either. The certainty hit me like a wave. He didn't know it was me. The same shock that paralyzed me had paralyzed him, even if for less time, because Lucian Beaumont was the kind of man who recomposed himself in fractions of a second, who turned shock into control before anyone noticed he'd been caught off guard. And that's exactly what he did. His face recomposed, his shoulders adjusted, and the eyes that had widened for an instant were now locked on mine with an intensity I could feel on my skin. And then he did something that demolished every scenario I'd built in my head over 5 days of nightmare. He smiled, not the professional smile, not the corner smile he used when something struck him as interesting. A real smile, small, almost imperceptible, that started at the corner of his mouth and rose to his eyes, and that said, with the clarity of a full sentence, "It's you." The ceremony happened as if in a dream. I was there, standing beside him, listening to the priest speak in French about commitment and honor and union, and not a single word registered because my brain was too busy trying to reorganize the universe around the information that Lucien Beaumont, the man I wanted, was the same man I was being forced to marry. The answers I gave were automatic, my voice steady on pure instinct. And when the priest said the groom could kiss the bride, I looked at Lucian with a silent question that he answered without words. He kissed me, and it wasn't the ceremonial kiss I'd expected, the kind that exists to fulfill protocol and is forgotten the next second. It was a real kiss, warm, lingering, with his hand at the base of my neck and his mouth on mine with a pressure that made me forget there was an entire chapel watching us. I tasted him, felt his warmth, the same contained urgency from the night I thought would never repeat, and when we pulled apart, my lips were tingling, and his eyes held something I'd never seen before, relief. On the way out of the chapel, Gerard approached with an expression that mixed satisfaction and caution, and said with the tone of someone who can't resist an observation, "For someone who didn't want to get married, that kiss said a lot." I didn't answer, not because I had nothing to say, but because any response would have involved words that weren't appropriate for the exit of a church. My phone buzzed in the hidden pocket of the dress. "Theo, girl, tell me everything. Who is he? Is he awful? Do I need to come rescue you?" Before I could reply, another message. "Wait, a friend of my cousin was at the chapel and sent me a photo. Eloise Renard. That wasn't a kiss. That was a trailer for an adult film." I almost laughed in the middle of the guests, which would have been catastrophic, but I swallowed the laugh in time, and put the phone away before Lucien noticed. But when I looked at him, standing beside me with his hand on the small of my back, an automatic, possessive gesture he made, as if his body already knew where it belonged before his mind gave permission, the laughter died and gave way to something much more intense. I leaned toward him and said quietly, so only he could hear, "You have a lot of explaining to do." Lucien looked at me with that half-smile I was beginning to understand was his version of a full laugh, and replied with his hand still firm on my back and his deep voice near my ear, "I know, but not here." Chapter 6. The First Layer. The car took us to an apartment that wasn't the same one from that night. This one was in a higher neighborhood of Marseille, on a quiet street lined with old buildings with stone facades and wrought iron balconies that looked like they'd survived 2 centuries without anyone daring to touch them. Lucien opened the door without a word and let me in first. And when I passed him, I felt his hand brush the small of my back again, the same gesture from outside the chapel, automatic, possessive, as if his body had decided that was where his hand belonged and wasn't open to negotiation. The apartment was spacious, with high ceilings and wide windows that let in the amber light of late afternoon over Marseille. There were few pieces of furniture like the other place, but these were different, heavier, older, chosen by someone who valued permanence. A dark wooden bookshelf covered the entire wall of the living room, and above the unlit fireplace, there was a single black and white photograph of a young woman with eyes I recognized immediately, because they were the same eyes that looked at me every day from across the desk at the office. His mother. I didn't comment on the photo. It wasn't the moment, and from the way Lucien walked past it without looking, I understood that the image was the kind of thing that stayed there not to be seen, but to be felt. He took off his jacket, loosened his tie, and poured himself a glass of whiskey at the bar in the corner of the room. He didn't offer me one because he still hadn't spoken, and the silence between us was so loaded with unspoken things that it seemed to have physical weight. I stood in the middle of the room, still in a wedding dress, in shoes that were starting to hurt, and with patience that had run out at least 3 chapels ago. "Lucien," I said, and his name in my mouth sounded different now that it was also my husband's name. "You owe me the truth. All of it. Now." He took a sip, set the glass on the counter with a care that contrasted with the visible tension in his shoulders, and turned to face me. His gray eyes met mine with an expression I'd never seen on him. Not the control from the office, not the intensity from that night, but something rawer, more exposed, as if he'd decided that from this point forward, the armor no longer served its purpose. "Sit down," he said, pointing to the couch. "This is going to take a while." I sat. He didn't. He stood, leaning against the bar, arms crossed, and his gaze fixed on me as if he were measuring where to begin dismantling the world I knew. "What do you know about the company where you work?" he asked. "That it's a logistics and import company, that it has offices in Marseille, Lyon, and Paris, that your father founded it and you took over a few years ago. All of that is true," he said, "and none of it is the full story." Lucien started talking, and what came out of his mouth over the next 30 minutes rearranged every piece of the puzzle I thought was my life. Beaumont Corp was a front. It functioned, turned a profit, had real clients and legitimate operations, but it existed to launder money and protect the structure of something much bigger. The Beaumont clan. A family that had operated within the milieu, the French organized crime underworld, for 3 generations, a historic ally of the Union Corse, the Corsican Mafia that dominated trafficking and politics in the south of France. The clan's power lay in port logistics, private casinos, regional political influence, and a network of alliances held together by 2 pillars, loyalty and marriage. "Marriages in the clan aren't for love," Lucien said, his voice flat, like someone reciting a rule he learned before he learned to read. "They're alliances, pacts. My father, Edouard, made a deal with a man named Dominique Metzger, the leader of a rival organization called Brise Noire. The pact turned enemies into partners, and part of that pact included a marriage. My marriage to the daughter of a man who owed the clan. My father," I said, and it wasn't a question. "Your father," he confirmed. "Gerard got involved with people connected to the clan years ago. The debts he mentioned are real, but they're not just financial. He made promises he didn't keep, took on commitments he couldn't sustain, and when the bill came due, the currency was you." I absorbed every word with the mechanical precision of someone taking notes in a notebook instead of listening to the demolition of her own story. Not because it didn't hurt. It hurt in a way I didn't have a name for, but because if I stopped to feel, I wouldn't be able to keep listening, and I needed to hear all of it. "The marriage was negotiated between Edouard and Gerard," Lucien continued. "I found out I was getting married 2 months ago, but my father didn't tell me who. He only said it was the daughter of a man who owed the clan. No first name, no last name, no detail that would let me find her before the ceremony. That's how Edouard operates. He keeps every piece isolated until the last second, because the less I know, the less I can sabotage." "And you agreed to marry without knowing?" I asked. and the question came out with more disbelief than I intended. I had no choice. And even if I'd looked, the name Edouard used in the deal was Gerard's middle name, not Renard. I only learned the real surname when I saw your face at the altar. The information hit me in 2 layers. First, that Lucien had been kept in the dark just as much as I had. Second, that Gerard had a middle name I'd never heard, and that was well known enough in that world to serve as an identity, another piece of my father's life that I didn't know. That's why the rule, I said, and the missing piece finally clicked into place with an almost audible snap. One night. Just one. Because you already knew you were getting married. Because I already knew I was getting married, he repeated, and his voice dropped half a tone in a confession that seemed to cost him more than everything he'd said up to that point. To another woman, or to who I thought would be another woman, and I couldn't start something I had no way of continuing. The room fell silent, the kind of silence that isn't empty, but full of everything those words meant, of all the nights I'd spent awake imagining a monster at the altar, of all the days he'd avoided me in the hallway carrying the same weight I was carrying without knowing. I looked at him, he looked back, and in that moment, in the middle of the living room of an apartment in Marseille, still in a wedding dress, and with the weight of an entire world I didn't know crashing down on my shoulders, I did the only thing that made sense. So, technically, I said, and my voice came out with a calm that surprised me. You cheated on me with myself? Lucien stood still for a second, 2, 3, and then something happened that I'd never seen. His face broke, not in pain, not in shock, in laughter, a real laugh, low and rough, that started in his chest and rose to his eyes and stayed there, transforming the most controlled man I'd ever known into someone I barely recognized. And the sound of that laugh made something inside me let go. A knot I didn't even know was tight gave way all at once, and I laughed too, first quietly, then louder, until both of us were laughing in the middle of a room with a black and white photograph on the mantel and an arranged marriage on our backs, and the truth laid bare between us like a card turned face up on the table. Technically, he replied, still with the laugh in his voice. Yes, I cheated on my arranged bride with my arranged bride. This is so absurd it sounds like a telenovela script, I said, wiping my eyes. If it were a telenovela, at least I would have had time to prepare, he returned, and his smile faded, until it only remained in the corners of his mouth, in that place where I already knew his smiles lived. The laughter faded, but the lightness stayed. Not the lightness of someone who's forgotten the weight, the lightness of someone who's finally shared it with someone else. And in the space that opened between the truth and whatever came next, we both sat in silence for a moment that didn't need words, because for the first time since it all began, we were on the same side of the same story. The night moved slowly, as if Marseille had decided to give that Friday more hours than any other. I kicked off my shoes and sat on the couch with my legs tucked under me, and Lucien sat beside me, not too close, not too far, at the exact distance of someone learning to share the same space with another person without the rules that used to govern every interaction between us. He told me more, about his father, Edouard, who still ran things behind the scenes with the quiet authority of a man who'd built an empire and had no intention of fully handing it over, about Bastien Morel, the consigliere I'd met in the break room, loyal to the patriarch above all else, the kind of man who smiled while he calculated, about Cillian, the right-hand man who watched me at the office not out of curiosity, but out of protocol, because everything that came near Lucien was monitored. And me? I asked. Was I being monitored? Lucien hesitated for half a second, enough for me to notice. Everyone who works on the executive floor is observed, he replied, and his choice of words told me the full answer was bigger than that, but he was giving me what I could take in that night without the ground opening up again. I accepted it, not out of naivety, but by choice, because the amount of truth that had already landed on me that day was enough for a lifetime, and what I needed in that moment wasn't more revelations, it was presence. And Lucien, who spent his days controlling empires and hiding what he felt behind impeccable suits and calculated silences, seemed to understand that without me having to say it. His hand found mine in the space between us, his fingers lacing through mine slowly, with the care of someone touching something they don't want to break. And I let him, for the first time, without rules, without deadlines, without the shadow of a "this can't happen again" hanging over us. The conversation grew lighter as the hours passed. I asked questions that had nothing to do with the clan or the milieu, questions about him, what he ate for breakfast, what music he listened to when he was alone, whether he'd always been this way, or if the coldness was a recent acquisition. He answered with his usual economy of words, but with an openness I felt like a door being unlocked for the first time in years. And between one answer and the next, between one comfortable silence and the one that followed, I began to realize that the man sitting beside me was both familiar and unknown, because the hot boss at the office and the lover from one night were only the outer layers of someone I still didn't truly know. At some point in the night, I noticed we were too close. My head had found his shoulder without me deciding to put it there, and his hand was on my thigh with the ease of someone who'd been doing it for years, not hours. The warmth of his body came through the fabric of the dress and reached my skin like a silent promise of everything that hadn't happened yet. Because the night was long, and we now had every night ahead of us, and the urgency that had defined our first time no longer existed. There was no rush. There was closeness, his mouth in my hair, his fingers tracing circles on my hand, his voice growing lower and rougher as the hours passed, and the city outside went quiet. There was the moment I turned my face, and his lips were right there, millimeters from mine, and the kiss that came was different from all the others, slow, deep, without urgency, the kiss of a man who finally didn't have to stop. And there was the after, his arms around me, his chest against my back, his breath on my neck, while I looked up at the apartment ceiling and felt, for the first time in 5 days, that the ground beneath me was solid. Now I'm going to have to rediscover who this man is, I said quietly, more to myself than to him, but knowing he would hear, because the hot boss was just the first layer. Lucian was quiet for a moment. I thought he'd fallen asleep, but his hand tightened around my waist slightly, and his voice came almost in a whisper, heavy with sleep, and something that felt like a confession. I heard what you said in that hallway, every word. I smiled in the dark, and the smile stayed, even when his breathing grew heavy and steady against the back of my neck, and I knew he'd fallen asleep. I stayed there, awake, for a while longer. The apartment was silent, and Marseille glowed through the window like a map of lights that I now saw with different eyes. Because somewhere down there, in those streets, and that harbor, and those alleys I'd never set foot in, there was an entire world that belonged to the man sleeping beside me. A world that, as of that night, was mine too. And then, in the instant before sleep took me, a thought crossed my mind. Not like a revelation, not like a jolt, like a question that lights up slowly, like a light flickering at the end of a dark hallway that you notice without meaning to. Gerard, my father, a man I'd always known as someone simple, ordinary, a man of small jobs and modest ambitions, who raised his daughter alone in a 2-bedroom apartment in Marseille. How did a man like that have debts with the Beaumont clan? How did he even know people from that world? What kind of promises had he made? And to whom? And why? The question stayed there, floating. I didn't have the energy to chase it, and the warmth of Lucian against my back was too convincing for any thought to survive for long, so I let it go, let it dissolve into sleep, along with the last remnants of a day that had started with a dress in a white box, and ended with the discovery that the worst nightmare of my life had the face of the only man I wanted. I closed my eyes. The question vanished, but it stayed. Lena here. That wraps up Book 1, and I've already finished Book 2. You can get access to it for a really small fee. I thought the worst was behind me. The arranged marriage, the shock at the altar, but the questions about my father wouldn't leave me alone, so I went looking for answers. I thought I knew everything about Lucian, and was only searching for answers about my father, but I knew nothing. Because when I opened the wrong box in Gerard's office, the name I found shouldn't have existed. Not in that document. Not with that signature. I looked at the paper, and the ground disappeared. Everything I believed about who I am died in 3 seconds. And the man who sleeps beside me every night, the man I love, might be the only person in the world I should never be with. Some truths don't set you free. Some truths destroy. As you can see, that was just a little taste of Book 2. To watch the full uncensored version, just click the first link in the pinned comment. I'll see you on the other side in just a few seconds. Just a reminder, click that first link down in the comments, and the complete Book 2, ad-free and uninterrupted, will be waiting for you. It's that simple. I'm absolutely loving working on Book 2, and since you guys are loving it too, I promise there's more to come. This is where you'll find stories that get even steamier, true dark romance. And because this version is getting so much more spicy, the video wouldn't be well received publicly on YouTube. This private space is where I can really show my true essence, and where I feel free to do my best work for you all. Keep in mind that the channel has been demonetized. So this is a way for me to keep my team together and continue bringing high-quality stories to you. I'll have even more updates for you soon. I'll be waiting for you at that first link in the pinned comment. Unfortunately, many people have been downloading our audio, effectively copying the entire story, and simply reposting it on YouTube. If you want to watch the original story and be the first to receive the next ones, search for My Stories by Lena on YouTube to get the best dark romance content. Remember, the official channel is My Stories by Lena on YouTube. I'll be waiting for you there.